This is about the cervical cancer vaccine, HPV vaccine. In fact, I was on the committee, the Joint Committee on Vaccination, that advised putting this into use. And there was a determined onslaught from the Mail. Now, the Mail famously runs headlines that are, coffee is good for you one day and coffee is bad for you the next day. But on cervical cancer, they completely surpassed themselves, because in their Irish edition, they were running a campaign to have the cervical cancer vaccine introduced, because it wasn't going to be introduced in Ireland, whereas in Britain, they were running headlines saying we mustn't have it introduced. So they were both having their cake and eating it. And this story was about, the headline here says, girl left in waking coma and sleeps for 23 hours a day after severe reaction to cervical cancer jab. Scary, really scary stuff. And do these things matter? I mean, here was what the Express ran. Jab is as deadly as the cancer. I mean, it's an extraordinary headline. And if you read that, you really would be very frightened. And you could say, well, does it really matter? These are mad headlines. Surely people don't believe them. Well, actually, it really does matter if people believe those sort of headlines. Cervical cancer vaccine was induced, or HPV vaccine rather, was introduced in 2009. And at the time, the evidence of the impact of that vaccine had been modelled, but obviously models don't always work out. But actually, the real results came in 2013, and introducing that vaccine caused a 70% drop in the incidence of cervical cancer amongst vaccinated schoolgirls. So that's an extraordinary drop. That vaccine has had a fantastic impact. And yet those sorts of headlines were making people really worried about whether they should let their teenage girls have the vaccine. So we think in very, very different ways. So let me just do a bit of compare and contrast. So scientists write the conclusion last in a science paper, and they're interested in all the data and all the news. They wait until publication to release the results. And they often think that the media's purpose is to educate. I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that when I went into the newsroom of the News of the World, the news editor did not sit us down at conference every morning and say, what shall we educate the public about today then? That was not what he said. So, compare and contrast with journalism. We write the conclusion first, not last. We're not interested in good news. We're much, much more interested in bad news. And actually, those of you who feel rather smug and say, ooh, they're only interested in good news, how many of us buy newspapers when there's a big headline about a disaster, or switch on the television when there's a big explosion or accident or whatever it is? We read the papers, we return to the media when it's bad news. In general, unless it's us winning the Olympic bid, or we don't switch on the media for good news. And we can't wait 2 seconds before telling someone else. And actually, that's why I think scientists and journalists, are very similar. Because we want, and I have kind of both genes, and I want to tell people about science. I can't resist. If I come across a really fascinating piece of science, I will stop literally people in the street and tell them about this and how fantastic it was. And journalists do that too. We're curious, we're driven by it. We think the media's purpose is to sell newspapers, or if we're online, to be there first with the news. Now, people always have a kind of You know, scientists often say to me, you only do it to sell newspapers. It's almost as if you walked into Tesco and say, you only do it to sell baked beans. Well, of course, that's what we're there to do. But actually, if we did what scientists sometimes want us to do, which is to educate the public, would people read the newspaper or watch the TV if we were school? No, they wouldn't. So education comes as a kind of byproduct of big news stories, but it's not what we're there to do. What we're there to do, I think, is to be the fourth estate. We're there to challenge science. We're not there to collude with science. And some of you might disagree with that, but I think our role is to challenge, to make sure that what's said is being true, and all of those sorts of things.